me in a round of applause. They have their names and titles on the screen. And because we want to stay on schedule, because of votes in the Senate schedule, we're going to move right into this panel discussion, and we'll have our full break at 11:15. So thanks to the members of the Virginia Senate for being here, for your public service, and Dr. Holsworth for moderating this panel. Bob?
Great. Again, we have another extraordinary panel. We have Senator Norment, Mason, Donovan, and Peterson. We're going to begin right away, and we're going to turn to Senator Norment and ask him, what does he see as the key business and economic development issues facing the Assembly this year?
Thank you very much, Bob. A couple of things. One, I think maintaining fiscal conservatism, particularly as it relates to any revenue enhancements, i.e. taxes. I think that Virginia needs to continue to maintain its business-friendly state. There are obviously some areas that we can continue to improve on. I think we're off to a good start. The Senate Committee on Courts of Justice has rejected some tort reform issues that probably would have created some concern amongst the business community. We heard very articulately from Delegate Matthew James, who spoke about workforce training, workforce transition. We have a lot of unfilled jobs in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I think as we continue to try to realign some of our educational components, particularly in the community college system with the outstanding jobs, that will prove an enhancement. We need to continue to look for increasing our tax base with economic development opportunities. I think that needs to be done in a little more deliberate manner. We have created a commission that is now made up of legislators that are vetting these economic prospects to be certain that we have both an executive branch buy-in and a legislative buy-in. So we need to continue to do that in a responsible manner to try to avoid any future hiccups that we've had in the past.
I'm going to turn to Senator Peterson. What do you see as the key business economic development issues that the legislature should be addressing this year?
Well, thank you, Bob, and thank you for the chamber for having me. I will tell you, I'm an attorney back home in Fairfax, Virginia, and I own my own business. And you know, for years I had various law partners, and I could never find someone that had the exact same financial incentives I did. And then I found out that if I went into business with my wife, I could kind of solve that issue. So I co-own a firm with my wife. She let me put my name on it. But we run our own business. We have 9 employees. We provide health insurance. And it's interesting, I go through all the same issues that you do, regulatory. In fact, I was trying to get a sign for my business, and it took us 9 months to get the sign. And I say that because this is a town I grew up in, and you know, my uncle was the mayor, and I theoretically should know what I'm doing. So I am very sympathetic to people that say, gosh, you know, I run into this obstruction and that obstruction. Why can't you as a public official make it easier? And trust me, I'd like to. As I see the business issues of the Commonwealth, I'm going to step back away from politics because I'm really, as I'm sure some of the folks here can vouch for, I'm really not much of a politician. But I'm a pretty good businessman. My business has grown, and one of the things I've focused on is looking at populations in Virginia that are underserved. And I've focused particularly on non-English speaking populations. A lot of my representations in the Korean speaking community or in other communities that frankly most attorneys didn't advertise for. And I look at how Virginia economy, and I'm not going to say it's growing across the board because in many cases it's been somewhat stagnant compared to other states the last couple of years. But looking at how we develop international contacts, we bring businesses into Virginia, we help them grow, we help them develop, we get the investment capital. For example, we bring in students from foreign countries, we educate them in Virginia, they choose to live here, they choose to get married here, raise their families here, and that becomes part of the dynamic creativity that really drives growth. So those to me are issues that I think help Virginia. I will tell you that, you know, my family's, I tell people I'm not the second, I'm actually the third member of my family to hold this seat in the state Senate, and my great-grandfather held it in 1899, and I came in 2001 in the House, so some families had an off year, we had an off century. But the bottom line is, I look at Virginia, and to me, the economic growth of this state in the long term, which is to say over a 20 to 40-year horizon, is how are we matching up with the international economy, and how are we competing in an international economy?
Okay. Senator Donovan, your sense, what are the key business economic development issues that you're interested in?
Well, the nice part is you're going to get a complementary perspective here because I endorse a lot of what's already been said. But for me, the dovetailing that is so imperative is the cost of health insurance. That is one of the most important issues that we have facing us this year, and it's the thing I hear the most about from both constituents and patients. So we have a robust package that we're using to address private sector and how we're going to reduce costs, including an association plan that will free you up from some of the regulations of Virginia so that small businesses through the chamber can buy less expensive health insurance. So we've got to deal with health insurance in the private sector. And when you really look at economic development and economic opportunity, you can't even have a conversation about that unless you have a healthy, prepared workforce. So it's got to be education for me too. And we're looking at some significant issues with education. We've all heard about the strain that we have with student debt and the strain that we have with tuition costs and how are we funding these things. And we have some creative ways to look at that. One is we're going to kind of refocus the community college into a highly reliable organization where if you get a credit there, it's going to count when you go on to higher education for your core curriculum credits. So we're not paying twice. A lot of students now are spending 2 years in community college and 4 years in higher ed. And so we need to make sure that we iron that out. So we've got some legislation to look at that. We're also looking at a strategic financial plan for higher education, which is where we can look at some of these issues. How do we connect business? One, historically in Virginia, we have looked at degree attainment. We've said if you get a baccalaureate degree, you are going to earn this much money and you're going to be a contributor to our tax base. That's not exactly true. We are exporting a lot of our degrees, and we also are underemployed. We're a little bit better than the national average. Nationally, baccalaureate graduates are underemployed at 30%. In Virginia, we're underemployed at 27%. It's not really getting us the bang for the buck we want in our tax base. So we have to connect better business and higher ed so that we are preparing the degrees and the individuals. They want to be employed, you want employees, let's match that up. So my focus is going to be healthcare, education, and economy because they're all integrally related.
Senator Mason, how do you look at this?
Thank you very much. Thanks for y'all inviting me here today. From my perspective, it's all about budget, because, you said Delegate Mason, when I've not seen the budget from the Senate side be crafted yet. And in the House, I had to watch, and I wasn't on the Appropriations Committee, of course, so it's how you try to figure out what is going and what's going to be put in front of you. I'm not on the Senate Finance Committee, so it's trying to keep up with all of the big needs and the big numbers. And, everybody in this room knows about the tremor in the force with the bond rating agency. We've got to make sure that we shore up and keep Virginia's positioning with the AAA bond rating. That's a must. So that requires reserves and maybe not going back and leaning on them every half year. I got to see it last year from the midway point. And so figuring out what's in front of us is, and back at home, I have the benefit of sitting on a lot of panels with Senator Norman, and I'll say, well, the number associated with this is X, and he goes. And I said, the number here is Y, and he goes. So it's always a bigger number than we anticipate with K through 12 benchmarking, higher education, the big challenges we have in front of mental health, and you always leave 2 or 3 really big, significant things off. And so trying to figure out how we craft a budget, keep your eye on that, making sure the things that you're interested in are in front of you when you're not on the committee is quite a challenge. We mentioned economic development. I do have a background there. I was glad last year with some of the problems we'd had in economic development in Virginia that we didn't just blow it all up, because look, they're going to be misses. We're going to go after projects that don't land 100% like we'd hope. But you understand that in business, that we go after things and we target, but maybe we didn't land the business and the 87 jobs, but maybe we had curbs and gutters and infrastructure developed around the property, and so we took an incremental step. So it's important not to paint things as just entire successes or failures, but look to the opportunities and the chance to seed. And I think Go Virginia is a huge example for that in our future, and something we have a chance to take full advantage of.
Let me follow up on that with you, Senator Mason. Both Blueprint and Stephen Murray in the Virginia VEDP have basically suggested that the lack of site development is a real hindrance to Virginia economic development. And in fact, yesterday, the Wall Street Journal had a major story saying the same thing is happening in North Carolina. They felt they lost in part the Toyota Mazda plant because they don't have enough ready sites.
Right.
How's that issue in Virginia, and how do you think the General Assembly can deal with that?
Well, and I think they're regional, that's one place that regional area groups have to pull together. I know initially this year in the Southeastern Virginia Chamber package, I initially had seen a Chesapeake site development opportunity. I'm not sure that that made it to the final package, because just because you live in Williamsburg and James City County doesn't mean you need to we really need to put our efforts behind something in another locality that would be prepared to advance it. That is a tough sell because you have to put a lot of money into something that is very nebulous. So you have to develop and you have to commit to something that you don't have a product yet to sell. But I think it is of critical importance, and we have to identify at least a handful of opportunities or areas that we have, and then get groups, maybe surrounded from the chamber, by the chamber, or groups like this, together to help us prioritize, to help us have the conversation around what we could attract, what the impact could be. But again, at some point, you will have to help us with the public selling that we have allocated X millions of dollars of resources to do this with really no project in mind, but with opportunity in mind.
Senator Donovan, about site development?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we've looked at before, and you've heard the statement before, the needs are many, the dollars are few. And so that's a particular interest of Senator Ruff. And he's worked hard to look at site development and see if we can fund that and set that up. I would agree with Monty. I think that Go Virginia is a way that we can regionally coordinate efforts and begin to look at some of those specifics instead of globally from the statewide perspective in a regional way that might be more effective than trying to fund it as we're working the budget.
Senator Peterson?
Okay, I'm going to be the skeptic here. Talk about site development. Look, a lot of people in this room have probably done real estate development. If a site has value, a private investor is probably going to snap it up and go ahead and develop it. And so if no one in the private market's coming forward to develop a site, maybe it's not the greatest site. So I'm very wary about spending state money on what would be a speculative project. That's number one. Number two, about Go Virginia, and I do believe that the state has a role in being proactive in economic development. I believe that strongly. I also believe that we tend to sort of, anytime we see a problem in Virginia, we tend to create a new agency as opposed to eliminating an agency or consolidating an agency. Right now we have VEDP, Virginia Economic Development Partnership. We have Go Virginia. We have what we used to call the Governor's Opportunity Fund, now called the Commonwealth Opportunity Fund. Plus we have large counties like Fairfax have their own Chamber of Commerce. So we have all these individual actors out there, which are all basically doing the same thing, trying to use government to create jobs. I think to some level, I'd like to see some consolidation. I think we do have some overlap. I don't think it's the most efficient way of going about it. But to get back to your specific question, in terms of site development, unless it's a distressed area where we really need to go the extra mile, I really would expect that the private market would develop a site if it has economic potential.
Great. Senator Norman?
I didn't read the article in the Wall Street Journal, but I have some familiarity with what was going on in North Carolina with the Toyota Mazda. Actually, North Carolina was pretty bullish and confident at some point they were going to land that. And I think it really ought to be something of a wake-up call to Virginia, because North Carolina has more spade-ready developed sites than Virginia does right now. I have a different perspective than Senator Peterson on it. I think some of the economic development prospects out there, in fact, want a site that is ready for them to develop, that in fact it has the utilities and infrastructure in place so they can immediately come in and avoid such issues as rezoning, the extension of utilities and infrastructure to it. And I think long-term, it is a good investment. I also have a different approach than Senator Peterson on Go Virginia. I don't say it as a braggart, but I carried the Go Virginia legislation and worked very hard to get it through the General Assembly of Virginia. And some of my enthusiasm went back to 1699 when I was on the James City County Board of Supervisors. And one of the things that I have found in some geographical areas is that you find localities competing against one another for the same prospect. And one of the underlying premises of Go Virginia is insisting upon multi-jurisdictional involvement on projects. And it's aspirational in the sense that it is seeking to break down some of these parochial boundaries to have geographical areas move together on an economic prospect. And I would say I sit on what is referred to as the MEI Commission. And the MEI Commission consists of legislators who review the recommendations from the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. And the importance of that is that now we have a collaborative effort where you've got the executive branch of government working with the legislative branch of government and reviewing these prospects, and there is some preliminary determination whether or not that project is going to be embraced by the legislature, even though it may be effusive in the enthusiasm from governors. And so I think there's a fair amount of collaboration that is going on, and I'm not sure that a consolidation is the best approach on that.
Senator Peterson, let's
Yes,
turn to one of your non-controversial issues here, which is having to do with rate freeze, energy,
Sure.
and the like. In our last panel, we heard Delegate Hugo talk about the absolute need to have sort of more energy development in Virginia, and some of the critics of your legislation say it might prevent that down the road by not giving enough freedom for investment out of energy companies. So could you talk about your perspective and what that would mean for business development in Virginia?
Okay, well, first of all, how many people understand what the rate freeze was? Okay, that's about, well, I was going to say, well, I'll resist any parallels with the General Assembly when we voted on it in 2015, but I think there was an assumption that it would be an actual rate freeze. What in actuality is it basically took away the jurisdiction of the State Corporation Commission that historically would look at the earnings of our utilities, and when there were earnings over and above what was the sort of the certified ROE, the return on equity of 10%, that amount would be returned to the ratepayer in the form of refunds. In 2015, we took away the jurisdiction of the State Corporation Commission, and the ostensible reason was that the Clean Power Plan, as promoted by the Obama administration, was going to raise costs, and therefore the utilities needed more flexibility to deal with that. Well, of course, that never happened. The Clean Power Plan was, first of all, ruled unconstitutional, and then, of course, Obama's no longer president. So I brought a bill last year to basically go back to the traditional system whereby the State Corporation Commission would review rates, and where there were over earnings by the utilities, they would then return refunds to the customers. Now, this has been the system we've had dating back for many years, and I understand, and I'm sure Senator Norman will point out that we have suspended review before. But the bottom line was, my position was, and both as a ratepayer, as a residential ratepayer, and as a business ratepayer, you want to have the State Corporation Commission actually reviewing earnings, because this is a monopolistic provider. And so if you're not going to have competition, let's at least have accountability. Now, that bill was defeated. My bill was defeated in 2017. I brought the same bill back this year. It was defeated. But somewhere along the way, and it's not through me because I'm a relatively obscure and insignificant politician, the public mood started to change. The people said, gosh, why is it that we've taken away jurisdiction over this large, powerful corporation? Why don't we have regulation? Why don't we have refunds? What exactly are the benefits of this? And so now I think the Leviathan of the General Assembly is starting to respond to this, and we've seen some proposed legislation, and we'll see what comes out at the end. But to me, it just keeps coming back to this idea of competition and accountability. You know, I believe competition brings out the best in people. And we have a system where we've granted state-owned monopolies to certain companies. And there was a reason for that, okay, when we did that. But energy in and of itself, as an industry, is disaggregated. And I've represented oil and gas clients. I know very well what's going on in the market. And it's a market where merchant power producers and independent power producers, whether it's renewables, whether it's some type of merchant power producer, can come into the market. Oftentimes they'll have a better idea. They'll have a more innovative idea. They need a market to sell their power. They need access to the grid. Yes, we need to update the grid. But by the same token, where all the transmission lines are being owned by one company, we need some type of regulatory authority over top of that, okay? And you need to have accountability. And if you take away that accountability, basically what you're doing is you're telling that one company, you can essentially decide what the rates are going to be, and you can decide what the returns are going to be, and we're not going to have any accountability over that. And I oppose that. And again, I'm sure, since I have the misfortune of speaking first, you're probably going to hear everything that's wrong with what I just told you. And I won't get a rebuttal.
We only got 20
I won't get a
minutes.
rebuttal. But let me tell you something. at the end of the day, we will get accountability back in this system, and it needs to be done in a way that's fair to the ratepayer. It needs to be done in a way that doesn't depend on who's the best lobbyist up in Richmond, because I'm not a good lobbyist, okay? I'm not. But what actually is fair to the ratepayer and what's best for the Commonwealth. Thank you very much.
Senator Norman, you probably have a couple things other than ditto to say, so.
There would be no ditto to anything you just said, to be truthful with you. I've been involved with the deregulation and the regulation of electrical generation in the Commonwealth of Virginia for 12 or 14 years. But I've learned being an expert on a subject means you live 50 miles away from the subject, so I don't consider myself an expert on it. I would say a couple of things. Senator Peterson has been very proactive in introducing interesting pieces of legislation as it relates to specifically Dominion Virginia Power. And one of the good things about a legislative process is even if there are dissenting views, that we do listen attentively to those views. In the situation of some of the legislation, no, all of the legislation that Senator Peterson has introduced as it relates to Dominion Virginia Power has been rejected on a bipartisan basis by the General Assembly of Virginia. That's not intended to discourage him because each of us function independently, but it hasn't been a partisan issue. It has been a bipartisan issue. If you look at the current legislation that's pending before the General Assembly, and I predict will pass, is that Senator Wagner, who is a Republican and the chairman of Commerce and Labor, and the senior Democrat on the Commerce and Labor Committee, Dick Saslaw, have legislation that has been introduced to address the issue about the rate fee freeze and calling off the rate freeze. It's great to have some demagoguery about the cost of electricity and refunds, but it's very important to know that if you look within the PJM grid that we function in, that the cost of delivering electricity both on a residential level and on a commercial level in the Commonwealth of Virginia is significantly below that of our peers. So we have to appreciate that it is a regulated monopoly. I think Senator Peterson made a very good point about the clean power. Well, a lot of times state legislators react to that which is happening on the national scene. We don't have the crystal ball or the clairvoyance to know always how things are going to come out. But as we look and see what those legislators in Washington do when they work, sometimes we on the state level need to be mindful of what the potential consequences are and how that is going to potentially impact our reliable generators of electricity. And that was part of the reason that the rate freeze came in at the time. But of course, the Clean Power Act did not fare so well. So I think that the General Assembly continues to be very sensitive to the reliability of our grid, the cost of our grid, but trying to turn the system upside down on its head, even trying to remake the State Corporation Commission with the aspiration that you're going to get another person on there who may be more favorable to a minority position. That is not the way to govern.
Senator Mason?
Okay, so this stuff is hard. I've been in business for 30 years, and nobody's ever asked me to do anything but cut the lights on. They didn't ask me about getting the power to the building. And so without being self-deprecating, it's very difficult to dig in to the nuts and the bolts of these things. But I also think there's a strong distinction that needs to be drawn between campaigning and government, okay? And I have had two opportunities to either support or not support two big initiatives for Dominion. I voted for one, I voted against the other. There are two projects that they've been involved in since I've been in Richmond. I've supported one, I've been against the other. Because I look at each and every one of them independently with the information provided me. I may or may not be making the right call, but I at least evaluate as much of the information as I can from every side. Now, I mentioned earlier, getting through the budget and understanding the budget without being on finance. Well, again, I am not on the committee of jurisdiction and have a 60-page bill that I haven't made it through yet. But I've talked to Dominion about their side and asked for their input. I've talked to the environmental groups and asked for their input. I've talked to the wind and the solar energy and asked for their input. I want to hear what everyone thinks. With the rate freeze decision, I realize that it is just one component of the overall package of fees that come forth, but I was determined that over a 13-year period, because what we spread it out 7, rates would have increased in that one portion only 2%. And I thought, find me another business that has had 2% inflation in a dominant part of their rates over a 13-year period. Now, there's a lot more to it than that. But the same time goes, you talk about the grid. So it amazes people in my district to find out that Dominion doesn't know when your lights are out, that you've got to call them. But you can track, I can put on Google Maps and figure out how to get to the Omni Hotel and see exactly where I am, but our electrical grid can't tell you that my lights are out. So that's something we need to upgrade and we need to address. At the same time, some other groups are concerned that that could be a hole that you determine putting money to a grid upgrade, and we're not really sure what the metric is to show that it was meaningful. But, again, I try to make the decisions based on these complex matters with all the information on hand at the bill in front of me at the time, not with any nefarious means or not with any corrupt. That's a word that I've heard used, that, support of this was corrupt. And, I don't take offense to things up here, but I find that to be wholly untrue. And
I take offense to that.
umbrage. Someone often speaks of taking umbrage to that.
Senator Donovan.
There's not much to add to it after the three have spoken. I'll just say that this is the job. I think the rate freeze was made with the best intentions, making the best predictions about what we could anticipate in the future. Didn't play out that way. So now we have to take a step back and take a look at how we react to that scenario with the added information that we have now about the grid and the costs and the other issues that are a stress and strain on that industry. And that's what we do, if you want to look at it objectively, is that we've got to sort out the problem and figure out how to go forward. There's nobody in that assembly that I know of that isn't interested in the ratepayers and fairness and oversight and accountability. We all want that. That's probably was in all of our campaign pitches when we ran. I do take some umbrage to the inference that anybody that gives me money influences my vote. And I make decisions based on my principles and what I think is in the best interest of my constituents and our commonwealth, because we are a commonwealth. And so I think that letting the conversation deteriorate to that point was a mistake and misguided and politically motivated. But as far as solving the problem, we'll get it.
Senator Donovan, I'm going to keep you talking about another issue. Your fellow physician, Governor Northam, has said that Medicaid expansion, that it's really now time for Medicaid expansion in Virginia. He got elected on that platform. He won a pretty convincing victory, by 9%. What do you think is going to happen with Medicaid expansion in the Senate this year, and what's your position on it?
Well, with all due respect to the governor, I disagree with his diagnosis and his treatment plan. And so let me break that down for you. Number one, on the exit polls, what was said is, what is your biggest concern? It was health care. Again, I will reiterate that for my constituents in my district office, that's the cost of health care. Are people concerned about the welfare of their fellow citizens that are in most need? Absolutely. But when I poll my district, the number one issue is the cost of health care. And when you ask them about Medicaid expansion, despite all the polls you've seen done by other groups that may have had questions that suited their objective, when I poll my district, they tell me that less than 50% are in favor of Medicaid expansion. And for those that are, they want, by a vast majority, they want to expand to the individuals that are in most need. So if we break down our system, it is not just about Medicaid expansion. You've got the private marketplace. We've talked about that. We've got some other things going on there. We've got accountability. Let's be consistent in our messaging. You guys know how we budget. We have a block budget that we receive from HHR every 2 years, and they say, this is everything you gave us 2 years ago. We want all of that. And occasionally we get reports on programs, and then they say, here's our caboose. By the way, we need the caboose. And then these are the new programs we want you to fund. I have a budget amendment in to transition HHR budgeting to pay for success. I think we need to have outcome measures. There's no arena in budgeting that is more amenable to this than HHR, because there's so much evidence-based measures that we have that we can put in place to hold programs accountable. We spend $250 million a year on mental health skills building. I don't know what that is, and I'm a physician. And how is that helping us achieve our goal of treating the mental health issues we have? So what do we need to do in Medicare, in my opinion? And I have an alternative proposal to Medicaid expansion. We need to make sure that we are meeting the needs of mentally ill, of chronic illness and life-threatening illness. We need to fund those damn Priority 1 waivers. There are over 3,000 people that are waiting for waivers that are dictated that we provide by the federal government, and we're not funding those waivers. We also need to deal with substance use disorder. We have implemented 2 years ago evidence-based programs to treat, so we've got a bimodal crisis with opiates, right? You've got prescribing that we're taking care of, you've got treatment. Medicaid instituted a program called ARTS, and that is Addiction Rehabilitation Treatment Services. We've had amazing outcomes with this. In fact, the program is so successful, it has more than paid for itself when we compare it to the diagnoses codes that we were looking at for ER admissions and treatment and emergency care. So we need to fund substance use disorder. We need to deal with childhood trauma. When people say, how do we bend the cost curve on these kids that are ending up in day placement at schools, and how do we address kids that are being so wounded by childhood trauma that they can't participate in our workforce? It's early diagnosis. We need to be funding that. And we actually still have a pretty significant challenge in transportation, especially for people with TDOs. Really, I'll be honest with you, in the governor's budget, we looked at what he spent his money on. He's drawn down all of this money, and 60% of the funding that we've drawn down is not spent on health care. It's spent elsewhere in the budget. What's going to happen in 2 years? It's going to be rolled up right in that old ball of wax in our general funds, and we're going to have to fund it again. So I propose that this is a better solution. I want to expand the GAP program to the Priority Needs Access Program. That will take some, we already have that waiver in place. We can do this immediately. We will draw down funds through hospital contributions. We will raise the Medicaid reimbursement rate for hospitals to 83 cents, which is above the statutory rate. And we're going to solve some of these problems in a fiscally responsible way that we can maintain accountability for. And meanwhile, we're going to have all these other things working like the private marketplace and our own accountability.
Senator Mason?
Well, I'm not a doctor, but I do have WebMD on my, but Dr. Holsworth, I appreciate you asking me every question. I feel like I'm in your class, give me the opportunity to tell you. Once again, I'm not qualified to answer this question, but I'll spare you the talking points and just suggest that Dr. Donovan made a good point that, yeah, the 3,000 level 1 waivers, they're like 11,000 waivers total. So we've got to figure out how to get there. You may not know what the $250 million to that mental health is, but we have a serious mental health issue, and our CSBs are being pressed, and their funding is such that we could stand to find other places for revenue. We are paying for things like inmate health care that could be covered under another approach. So again, I hope we take the opportunity to find places we can draw down revenues and funds. You heard the governor talk about the fact that, as we've heard for a while, Medicaid spending is growing and growing and growing. And not because we're expanding, but because people are living longer and so there's an issue there that he has a willingness to discuss and tackle and figure out what can we do behind to draw down some of the revenues to help facilitate the issues we have.
Senator Norman?
Well, first of all, Dr. Donovan is my physician, so I believe everything she says.
She has confidentiality with you.
I think a salient point, first of all, at some point, the partisan rhetoric needs to be toned down. The partisan rhetoric is divisive, and those who tend to be polarized on ideological positions get inflamed when the partisan comments come out. And I would say, while he's a dear friend, a fellow graduate of VMI, the governor did not do himself any favors on the State of the Commonwealth address on that particular subject. And I just say, I don't say that from a partisan standpoint. I say from a standpoint that Republicans and Democrats need to get together and address this issue. Second, I will fall somewhere between surprised and shocked if full Medicaid expansion passes this session of the General Assembly. And I think in the next couple of days, you'll get a clearer indication of it, the direction at least the Senate is going in. But having said that, Dr. Donovan makes a very important point. You, Dr. Holsworth, being the political pundit that you are, followed the exit polls after the November election. And about 40% of those who took the exit polls said health care was the #1 issue. They did not say Medicaid expansion is the #1 issue. They said health care. And what I have heard amongst my constituents, it reflects exactly what Senator Donovan said, and that is they are concerned about affordability of their policies and access. And I think as we move forward in the balance of this session, if something meaningful and constructive is going to come out of this 2018 legislative session, it needs to address accessibility and affordability. And the accessibility is picking up additional waivers. It is trying to extend some more benefits to the mental health patients that are being challenged and to those that are poor. I just don't see that coming out in a comprehensive, full Medicaid expansion. But we'll start making some progress here very shortly.
Senator Peterson.
All right. First of all, I get to go last finally. You know, I can't compete with Dr. Donovan on sort of how the medical profession works in terms of doctors putting their hands on patients, but I know a little bit about economics, and I will say this. First of all, anytime we expand waivers, we put more kids on the waiver program, we're expanding Medicaid, okay? Anytime we change the criteria or make people eligible for Medicaid, and we reach out with new services, or we reach out with the CHIP program or the FAMOUS program, we're expanding Medicaid. So we've been expanding Medicaid for years. We just didn't put a label on it. Now, let me make one economics point. And there's a few people in this audience, and please don't raise your hands, but when that tax was passed, and everyone over $250,000 making over $250,000 had to pay a surcharge in order to fund the Affordable Care Act, there's a few people that had to reach into their pocketbook or reach into their wallet and write that check, okay? And we wrote that check, and that check was written to the federal government. When are we getting that money back? When are we going to get that money back? Because right now, we haven't gotten a nickel of that money back. Now, that to me is not good economics. I will tell you right now, we leave money on the table from the federal government, and yet we have people uninsured. We have hospitals that are closing because they don't have sufficient reimbursements. We have people that are going without necessary care. So we have left money on the table with the federal government. Now, again, I'm not a physician. I can't explain to you the whys and wherefores and what's the best treatment, but I just know as someone that knows a little bit about economics, it doesn't make sense to donate money to an entity so it can go off to California so it gets spent by Jerry Brown or somebody. Okay, that to me doesn't make sense. So to me, let's forget the word Medicaid expansion because we're expanding Medicaid anyway. Let's talk about, in my opinion, reimagining Medicaid. And let me be a little bit critical of the Democrats, okay? All right? It's not just enough to spend more money in a program. Thank you. You've got to be more efficient in how you spend it. You've got to make use of technology. You've got to find ways to match doctors and patients more efficiently. You've got to find a way to get patients to get better outcomes where they're going to primary care physicians. They're not clogging up ERs. They're not going straight to specialists. You've got to have a managed care model that allocates resources more efficiently. So I don't think it's enough to just let's throw more money at it. I agree with the Republicans. But by the same token, the money that we've paid in taxation to Washington, D.C., there's really no reason not to bring it home in some form or another.
Thanks very much. Let's thank all our panelists for a great day and taking time out of their schedule to be with us.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I want to thank our panelists. Senator Norman had an 11 o'clock commitment and indicated to me that he might have to slip off a minute early. I really want to thank our panelists and thank them for joining us today. And you guys feel free to exercise. Did you?
One thing.
Senator Donovan has one more thing to say? Yes.
Uh-oh.
I'm so sorry. This is just such an imperative for the conversation. And so, first of all, I think that Senator Peterson's going to love my plan. But having said that, we need to be very careful about how we talk about Medicaid expansion because this language has been weaponized. And I will tell you that it's very careful how we talk about this if we actually want to collaborate and get support amongst all of the entities. Medicaid expansion is expanding under the Affordable Care Act. Medicaid expansion is transitioning Medicaid from a safety net for the most needy individuals to nationalized health care because you offer it to healthy adults. And if we use that language in any other way, i.e. exit polls, i.e. we're already doing it, do we need to draw down more money from the federal government? Yes. Do we need to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act? No. Sorry, I just needed to say that because it was an important group.
So let's thank the whole panel for their participation.